If you listen closely, you can still hear the fire breathing through black pine, as if the night itself refused to forget what happened there. Emily Carter froze at the edge of the evacuation line when she heard it, a faint, desperate whimper lost beneath the shouting of guards and the crackling warnings echoing through the village. Everyone else was moving away, following orders, following survival, but she stayed still for a fraction of a second too long, as if something inside her refused to accept what she was hearing. Emily was an Omega from the lower tier of the pack, never trained for command, never acknowledged for strength, only known for her calming presence that others dismissed as insignificant. Yet in that moment, something sharper than instinct pulled her attention toward the collapsing structure near the old timber storehouse, where smoke curled into the night sky like a living shadow. A second sound came, weaker, almost swallowed by the chaos, and that was when she saw it. A small wolf cub trapped near the broken beams, trembling, unable to move through the heat and falling debris. The guards were focused on clearing the perimeter, shouting that nothing remained inside worth risking lives for. But Emily felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. Without waiting for permission, she stepped out of line. Then she broke into a run. The heat grew stronger with every step, pressing against her skin like an invisible wall, but she didn't stop. Her mind was strangely silent, as if everything unnecessary had fallen away, leaving only the sound of that fragile whimper guiding her forward. Inside the collapsing structure, visibility dropped to nearly nothing, smoke curling through the air in heavy waves, but Emily moved carefully, instinctively, as if the world itself was whispering where to step. She found the cub near the base of a shattered beam, its small body barely visible beneath drifting ash. For a moment she hesitated, not from fear for herself, but from the realization of how little time remained. Then she lowered herself, wrapping her arms carefully around the trembling creature, shielding it against her chest. "It's okay," she whispered, though her voice barely carried. "You're not alone." She turned back the way she came, each step slower now, more deliberate, as debris shifted and the structure groaned above her like a warning. Yet she did not let go. Outside, beyond the smoke and collapsing wood, a presence arrived at the edge of the chaos, one that made even the guards straighten instinctively without understanding why. Alpha King Kael Draven stood at the boundary of the burning perimeter, his gaze scanning the scene with controlled intensity, but what he saw was not what he expected. There was no chaos of rescue left to command, no Omega waiting to be let out, only the fading echo of something already decided without him. And somewhere within the smoke, Emily Carter continued walking out of the fire, unaware that the moment she chose the cub over fear had already been witnessed by a king who would remember it long after the flames were gone. The first thing Emily Carter noticed when she stepped out of the smoke was the sudden absence of noise, as if the world itself held its breath to understand what she had just done. The cold night air of black pine wrapped around her, cutting through the lingering heat of the fire, but she did not stop moving. In her arms, the small wolf cub shifted weakly, its breathing uneven but present, and that alone kept her focused forward. Around her, members of the pack stood frozen at a distance, some calling out instructions, others simply staring as if they could not process that an Omega had walked into danger without hesitation. Emily kept her eyes down, not because she was afraid of them, but because her entire attention was on keeping the cub safe through every step away from the collapsing structure. She did not notice when the silence around her changed, when it became heavier, sharper, almost pressurized, like the air itself was responding to something approaching. Only when the guards nearest the perimeter lowered their voices did she finally slow. That was when she felt it, a presence that did not belong to the chaos, something controlled, deliberate, and impossibly still. She looked up just as the line of armored figures parted. Slightly, and there he was. Alpha King Kael Draven stood at the edge of the clearing, his dark coat unmoving in the wind, his gaze fixed not on the fire but on her. There was no urgency in his expression, no confusion, only a quiet intensity that made everything around him feel distant. Emily instinctively tightened her hold on the cub, unsure why this stranger carried such weight in the atmosphere, but something in her instincts reacted before her thoughts could form. Kael Draven took a single step forward, slow and measured, his attention never leaving the small bundle in her arms. The guards shifted uneasily, as if waiting for a command that did not come. Emily hesitated, her body still aching from the heat and smoke, yet she remained upright, refusing to set the cub down even for a second. The Alpha King's voice finally broke the silence, low and steady, not directed at the crowd but at her alone. You went into the fire without hesitation. It was not a question, but it carried something heavier than judgment, something closer to recognition. Emily did not answer immediately. She was not used to being spoken to like this, as if her actions carried meaning beyond survival. Finally, she replied softly that she could not leave it behind. Her voice was quiet, almost uncertain, but it did not waver. For the first time, Kael Draven's gaze shifted slightly, not away from her, but to the cub, as if confirming something only he understood. The moment stretched, silent and unreadable, before he spoke again, his tone unchanged but carrying a subtle weight that made the air feel tighter. That is not just any cub. Emily did not know what he meant, only that the way he looked at the small creature was no longer distant. Something in the world had changed in that moment, though she could not yet understand what it was. Behind him, the last embers of black pine continued to fade into the night, but neither of them were looking at the fire anymore. Their attention was locked in a quiet collision of paths that had not been meant to cross, yet had already begun to bind without permission. The silence between Emily Carter and Alpha King Kael Draven stretched longer than she expected, not because either of them had nothing to say, but because something unspoken was already forming in the space between their attention. Emily stood still despite the exhaustion in her legs, holding the wolf cub closer to her chest, as if instinct alone could protect it from everything else in the world. The cub let out a faint sound, and she instinctively adjusted her grip, her focus narrowing again to its fragile breathing. Kael Draven observed this without interruption, his expression unchanged, yet his eyes followed every small movement with a precision that made it impossible to ignore him. Around them, the last remnants of Black Pine's evacuation continued in the distance, but the area near them felt isolated, as if the world had quietly stepped back. Emily finally spoke again, asking if there was something wrong with the cub, her voice careful, not challenging, only searching for understanding. The Alpha King did not answer immediately. Instead, he took another step closer, slow enough to signal control rather than threat, and stopped at a distance where even the guards behind him did not intervene. "It should not have been there," he said at last, his tone steady, carrying neither anger nor urgency, only certainty. Emily frowned slightly, not understanding what he meant, but before she could ask further, Kael Draven's gaze shifted briefly toward the burned structure behind her, as if measuring the aftermath in silence. Then he looked back at her. "You did not hesitate," he repeated, as though confirming a fact that already mattered more than it should. Emily shifted her weight slightly, unsure how to respond to someone who spoke like every action carried hidden meaning. She simply said that she could not leave something alive behind, especially not something that needed help. Her words were simple, untrained, but honest. For the first time, something subtle changed in the Alpha King's expression, not softness, not warmth, but a quiet recalibration, as if he had expected a different answer and now had to adjust to reality. The wind moved through the clearing, carrying the scent of smoke and ash, yet the space around Kael Draven remained strangely composed, untouched by the chaos behind them. Emily noticed, though she could not explain it, that even the guards seemed to maintain distance not out of order, but instinct. The Alpha King's attention returned to the cub once more, and this time, his voice lowered slightly, as if speaking less to her and more to the truth of what he saw. "That cub belongs to a line that does not survive accidents." Emily's grip tightened almost unconsciously, not in fear, but in confusion. She did not understand what kind of answer that was meant to be, only that it carried weight far beyond the moment she had found it. Kael Draven studied her reaction, then added, "And yet it survived because you chose differently." The words lingered in the cold air, not as praise, not as accusation, but as observation that seemed to shift the meaning of everything that had just happened. Emily finally met his gaze directly, something she had avoided until now without realizing it. There was no hostility in her expression, only quiet determination mixed with exhaustion. She asked, carefully, what he intended to do now. The question was practical, grounded, but it seemed to land differently in the space between them. For a brief moment, the Alpha King did not respond. Then he looked at the cub again, and his answer came with the same calm certainty as before. Now, I take responsibility for what has been revealed. The words were not explained, and they did not need to be. Something had already shifted in the night, something that neither fire nor distance could undo. And Emily Carter, still holding the small life she had chosen to save, stood at the center of it without yet understanding that she was no longer simply someone who survived the fire. The night had not truly ended for Emily Carter, even though the fire behind Blackpine had begun to collapse into quiet embers. She stood beside Alpha King Kael Draven with the small wolf cub still resting against her chest, its breathing steadier now, though still fragile enough that she refused to loosen her hold. The surrounding guards maintained a respectful distance, their attention divided between the Alpha King and the Omega who had walked through fire without permission. Emily felt none of their stares fully register in her mind, because her focus kept returning to the cub and the strange calm that had settled over Kael Draven. He had not moved to take the cub from her, nor had he ordered her to leave. Instead, he remained present, as if waiting for a decision that had already been made long before she understood it. Finally, Kael Draven turned slightly, his voice cutting through the stillness with controlled clarity, instructing that a transport carriage be prepared for immediate departure. The order was not loud, but it carried authority that reshaped the space around them instantly. Emily blinked, realizing only then that the situation had shifted beyond the fire, beyond the village, and into something far more uncertain. She asked quietly where they were going, her voice careful but steady. The Alpha King glanced at her briefly before responding that the cub could not remain in Blackpine territory and that its condition required oversight beyond local capability. He did not elaborate further, yet the implication was clear enough that even the guards shifted uneasily. Emily hesitated, glancing down at the cub, then back toward the dark horizon where Blackpine now lay behind them like a fading memory. She asked if she was expected to come as well, and for the first time, Kael Draven paused slightly before answering. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than before, not evaluating her as an Omega, but as if reconsidering something already in motion. He said simply that she would. There was no force in the statement, no command layered with threat, only certainty that left no room for argument. Emily Carter felt a quiet tension rise in her chest, not fear, but confusion mixed with the growing awareness that her life had moved beyond the boundaries she had always known. Moments later, a transport carriage arrived, drawn by dark-coated horses that showed no sign of agitation despite the presence of alpha energy in the air. The interior was simple but reinforced, designed for travel across long distances. Kael Draven entered first, not taking the main seat of authority but positioning himself near one side, leaving space opposite him. Emily followed carefully, still holding the cub, unsure of where she was expected to sit or how she was expected to exist in this space that did not feel like it belonged to her. When the carriage began to move, the world outside shifted into motion, the last visible traces of Blackpine disappearing into the distance. Silence filled the interior, yet it was not empty. It carried weight, as if every unspoken question between them had taken physical form. Emily finally broke the silence by asking what would happen to the cub once they arrived, and whether it would be safe. Kael Draven looked at her again, and this time his answer was slower, measured, as if chosen carefully. He said that safety was not the question, but origin was. The cub was not ordinary, and neither was the moment she had chosen to save it. Emily lowered her gaze slightly, her arms still wrapped protectively around the small life in her care, unaware that every mile they traveled was pulling her further into a path that had already been set in motion long before she ever stepped into the fire. The carriage moved through the night road in steady silence, its wheels cutting softly across the uneven terrain that stretched beyond Blackpine's burned horizon. Inside, Emily Carter remained seated carefully, still holding the wolf cub against her chest, as if any change in position might disturb the fragile rhythm of its breathing. The dim lantern light inside the carriage swayed gently with each turn of the road, casting shifting shadows across the interior where Alpha King Kael Draven sat opposite her, in composed stillness. He had not spoken for several minutes, yet his presence never faded into the background. It remained constant, deliberate, as if silence itself was part of his intention. Emily found herself glancing at him occasionally without meaning to, trying to understand why someone of his rank would remain so focused on something as small as a rescued cub. The cub stirred slightly, drawing her attention back immediately, and she adjusted her hold again with careful patience. After a long stretch of silence, Kael Draven finally spoke, his voice calm but precise, asking if the cub had shown any unusual signs since she found it. Emily hesitated before answering, explaining that it had only responded to her voice and touch, and that it seemed calmer now than before. The Alpha King listened without interruption, his gaze shifting briefly toward the cub, as if confirming a thought that already existed in his mind. Then he asked her something unexpected, whether she had felt anything when she first heard it inside the fire. Emily blinked at the question, uncertain how to describe something she barely understood herself. She admitted that she had simply followed the sound, as if it was the only thing she could hear at that moment. Kael Draven leaned slightly back into his seat, his expression unreadable, yet there was a subtle change in the way he observed her now, as though her answer aligned with something he had already suspected. The carriage continued forward, the landscape outside becoming quieter and more distant, with only scattered lights from faraway settlements breaking the darkness. Emily eventually asked where they were headed, and Kael Draven responded that they were returning to the Central Territory where matters of lineage and origin could be properly examined. He did not explain further, but the mention of lineage caused a faint tension to settle in the air. Emily looked down at the cub again, noticing how small and ordinary it appeared despite everything surrounding it. She asked softly if the cub truly mattered that much. The Alpha King's answer came after a brief pause, his tone steady but carrying weight. He said that what appeared small in one moment could shift entire structures in another, depending on what it was connected to. Emily did not fully understand what he meant, but she sensed that the statement extended far beyond the cub itself. As the carriage continued through the darkened path, she became more aware of the distance between her life before the fire and whatever direction this journey was taking her. Kael Draven remained quiet after speaking, yet his attention never left the subtle details of her presence, the way she held the cub, the way she responded without hesitation despite uncertainty. Emily Carter, without realizing it, had stepped into a space where ordinary explanations no longer seemed enough, and every mile forward was pulling her deeper into something that had already begun long before she had ever chosen to run into the fire. The road ahead had grown quieter as the carriage left the burned perimeter behind, moving deeper into territory where the night felt less like chaos and more like controlled silence. Inside, Emily Carter remained still, her focus anchored to the wolf cub resting against her chest, its breathing now steady enough to give her a fragile sense of reassurance. Yet even in that small relief, she could not ignore the weight of everything surrounding her. Opposite her, Alpha King Kael Draven sat with the same composed stillness he had maintained since they departed Blackpine, his presence neither distant nor intrusive, but constantly aware. It was the kind of awareness that made silence feel intentional rather than empty. Emily shifted slightly, adjusting her posture to ease the strain in her arms, and noticed that the Alpha King's gaze briefly followed the movement before returning to the cub. After several minutes, Kael Draven spoke again, his tone calm, but carrying an undercurrent of precision as he asked if she had noticed any reaction from the cub to his presence. Emily considered the question carefully before answering that the cub seemed calmer with her, but had not shown any response to him specifically. The Alpha King did not react immediately. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, his attention narrowing as if processing information that carried more significance than it appeared to. He then asked whether she had experienced anything unusual at the moment she first made contact with the cub in the fire. Emily hesitated, recalling the overwhelming heat, the collapsing structure, and the strange clarity that had guided her movements. She admitted that everything else had faded except the sound of the cub and the instinct to reach it. Kael Draven listened without interruption, his expression steady, though something subtle in his eyes suggested recognition rather than surprise. The carriage continued along the darkened road, its motion steady, the sound of wheels over stone filling the space between their words. Outside, faint silhouettes of distant trees passed under moonlight, marking the boundary between territories that Emily had never thought she would cross. After another stretch of silence, she finally asked what would happen once they reached their destination. The question was simple, but it carried the weight of uncertainty she had been holding since leaving Blackpine. The Alpha King took a moment before answering, stating that they would reach a central stronghold where the origins of the cub could be properly examined and where certain truths would become clear. He did not elaborate further, but his tone made it clear that the matter extended beyond a simple investigation. Emily looked down at the cub again, noting how small and ordinary it appeared despite the attention it had drawn from someone like him. She asked softly if its origin truly mattered more than its survival. Kael Draven's gaze shifted toward her again, steady and unreadable, before he replied that survival, without understanding, often led to consequences that could not be undone later. Emily fell silent at that, absorbing the implication without fully grasping its depth. The carriage continued its journey through the night, the distance from Blackpine growing with each passing mile, and Emily Carter began to realize that whatever she had stepped into was no longer defined by a single act of rescue, but by something far larger that had already begun shaping itself around her without her permission. The carriage finally slowed as the landscape shifted into a structured horizon of distant torchlight and fortified silhouettes, signaling the approach of a central stronghold that stood far beyond the isolated edges of Blackpine. Inside, Emily Carter adjusted her posture slightly as the motion changed, still holding the wolf cub close against her chest, its small body now resting in a calmer rhythm that allowed her to breathe more steadily than before. The interior remained dim, illuminated only by the steady lantern light that swayed gently with each turn of the wheels. Across from her, Alpha King Kael Draven maintained his composed silence, though his attention remained subtly active, observing not only the cub but the way Emily carried herself through uncertainty without breaking focus. After a long stretch of quiet, the carriage slowed further as they approached a guarded gate, and the faint sound of shifting armor and controlled movement reached them from outside. Emily looked toward the narrow window, catching glimpses of tall stone walls and organized torch formations that marked the boundary of a territory far more structured than anything she had ever seen. Kael Draven finally spoke, his voice calm, instructing that they would be escorted through without delay and that the cub would be taken for immediate examination upon arrival. Emily tightened her grip instinctively at the mention of separation, and the Alpha King noticed the reaction without commenting on it directly. Instead, he added that she would remain present during the process, as her presence appeared to have a stabilizing effect on the cub. The carriage passed through the gate under careful supervision, and the atmosphere outside shifted from open road to controlled interior pathways lined with disciplined guards and silent observation. Emily felt the difference immediately, a sense of order that contrasted sharply with the chaos of Blackpine and the uncertainty of the journey. As they continued deeper into the stronghold, she finally asked where exactly they were, and Kael Draven replied that they had entered the central domain where matters of lineage, identification, and authority were governed directly under royal oversight. His explanation was brief, but it carried the implication that what they were dealing with was not a simple rescue or a temporary situation. The carriage came to a gradual stop in a courtyard illuminated by evenly spaced torchlight, and the doors were opened with measured precision. Emily stepped down carefully, still holding the cub, and immediately felt the scale of the place around her, vast yet controlled, with structures that conveyed both strength and purpose. Kael Draven exited after her, his presence immediately drawing subtle attention from the surrounding guards, though none spoke. He instructed that they proceed inside without delay, and Emily followed, aware that every step she took deeper into this place was carrying her further away from anything familiar. The cub shifted slightly in her arms as they entered the interior corridor, and she instinctively adjusted her hold again, her attention narrowing once more to its steady breathing. Kael Draven walked beside her now, not ahead, not behind, but aligned in a way that suggested her presence was not being directed but accompanied. After a moment, he spoke again, his tone quieter, stating that what she had done in Black Pine was not something that would remain isolated from consequence or recognition. Emily did not respond immediately, unsure what kind of answer was expected. The corridor stretched forward under soft, controlled lighting, leading them deeper into a space where answers were waiting, though none of them had yet been spoken aloud. The corridor opened into a vast interior chamber where controlled light replaced the open darkness outside, revealing a space designed with precision rather than comfort. Emily Carter stepped forward cautiously, still holding the wolf cub against her chest, aware that every surface around her reflected a level of order she had never experienced before. The air was cooler here, steady and filtered, carrying no trace of smoke or chaos, only a quiet stillness that felt almost unfamiliar after the fire. Alpha King Kael Draven walked beside her without hesitation, guiding her forward with measured steps that suggested he already knew exactly where they were going. Ahead, a group of trained attendants waited in silence, their attention immediately shifting toward the cub in her arms the moment she entered the chamber. Emily slowed slightly, instinctively tightening her hold again, but Kael Draven raised a hand just enough to signal calm, not command, and the attendants remained in place. He instructed them to prepare the examination space without unnecessary disturbance, and they moved with immediate efficiency, clearing a central platform designed for observation and care rather than restraint. Emily hesitated at the edge of the space, unsure whether she was meant to follow or remain still, but Kael Draven gave a slight nod toward the platform, indicating she should proceed. She stepped forward carefully and lowered herself to sit near the center, placing the cub gently in her lap while keeping her hands steady. The cub shifted slightly but did not resist, its breathing remaining stable under her touch. One of the attendants approached cautiously, not touching the cub yet, but observing closely before speaking quietly to the Alpha King, confirming that the markings on the cub matched nothing within standard records of Black Pine territory. Emily listened without fully understanding, sensing only that the discussion carried weight beyond simple identification. Kael Draven remained focused, his gaze fixed on the cub for several moments before shifting briefly toward Emily. He asked her to describe exactly where she had found it and what she had observed before and after the rescue. Emily answered carefully, recalling the sound that had drawn her in and the moment she had seen the cub trapped beneath the collapsing structure. As she spoke, the attendants exchanged subtle glances, and the atmosphere in the room shifted slightly, though no one interrupted her. When she finished, silence returned for a brief moment before Kael Draven gave a quiet instruction for a secondary observation protocol to begin. A faint energy barrier activated around the platform, not restricting movement, but stabilizing the environment, and Emily instinctively felt the cub relax further under her hands. She looked down at it, noticing for the first time a faint change in its breathing pattern, more synchronized with her presence than before. Kael Draven observed this closely, his expression unchanged but his attention sharpened. He then spoke again, this time more quietly, stating that the cub's response was not typical and suggested a deeper connection to an unknown lineage marker. Emily looked up slightly, uncertain what that meant, but before she could ask, he added that this was exactly why she had not been allowed to leave after the rescue. The statement was not restrictive in tone, but factual, as if describing a condition already in effect. Emily felt a subtle shift in understanding, realizing that her actions in Black Pine were not being viewed as an isolated act of courage, but as something that had triggered consequences beyond her awareness. The chamber remained quiet as the attendants continued their assessment, while Kael Draven stood at a measured distance, watching both Emily and the cub with a level of focus that suggested the situation was far from resolved, and that whatever truth was about to emerge would redefine everything that had already begun that night. The chamber remained perfectly still after the last observation protocol stabilized the space, as if even sound itself had been carefully contained within its boundaries. Emily Carter stayed seated at the center platform, her hands resting gently around the wolf cub, which now appeared calmer than it had at any point since she first found it in Black Pine. The subtle rise and fall of its breathing had become steady, almost synchronized with her presence, though she did not yet understand why. Around her, the attendants maintained their positions at a respectful distance, their attention fixed on controlled readings and silent observations that continued without interruption. Alpha King Kael Draven stood slightly apart from them, his gaze anchored not on the equipment or the reports being exchanged, but directly on Emily and the cub. There was a stillness in his expression that did not shift, even as one of the attendants stepped forward to quietly confirm that the cub's response pattern aligned with a rare and undocumented resonant signature. Emily heard the words, but could not fully interpret their meaning, only recognizing that the atmosphere in the chamber had shifted into something more serious than before. Kael Draven finally moved closer, stopping just short of the platform, his attention briefly lowering to the cub before returning to Emily. He spoke in a measured tone, stating that the connection observed here was not incidental and that it extended beyond instinct or proximity. Emily felt a faint tightening in her chest at the implication, though she remained silent, waiting for clarification that did not immediately come. The Alpha King continued, explaining that certain rare lineages did not respond to environments or external conditions in predictable ways, but instead reacted to specific individuals without prior explanation. Emily glanced down at the cub again, noticing how it shifted slightly closer to her hand without hesitation, as if confirming what had just been said. The attendants exchanged subtle looks, but did not interrupt. Kael Draven then instructed them to pause all secondary procedures, and the chamber fell into a deeper silence as the activity around them ceased. For a moment, it felt as though everything had narrowed to only 3 points of awareness: the cub, Emily, and the Alpha King. Emily finally asked softly what this meant for the cub, her voice steady but carrying uncertainty. Kael Draven paused before answering, his gaze remaining fixed on the small creature as he stated that it was no longer simply a rescued animal, but something tied to a line that carried significance far beyond Blackpine territory. Emily listened carefully, her grip on the cub tightening slightly not from fear, but from a growing awareness that the situation had expanded far beyond anything she had intended or understood when she first ran into the fire. The Alpha King's voice remained calm as he added that because she had been the first to stabilize it, her presence was now part of the ongoing condition that kept the cub stable. Emily did not respond immediately, absorbing the weight of that statement in silence. Around them, the attendants remained motionless, awaiting further instruction, but none came. Instead, Kael Draven simply observed her once more, as if confirming a conclusion that had already begun forming long before she arrived in this chamber. Emily Carter, still holding the cub that had changed the course of her night, slowly began to understand that her act of rescue had not ended when she left the fire, but had only marked the beginning of something that now could not be reversed.